Okay, y'all, once again, Joel has joined us, which is always fun. Look, they like you so much, you get a pause before you ever start.
Hopefully I can live up to it, but if I don't, the whiskey can, so.
Yeah. I'm just going to turn it over to you with no further introduction, since everybody kind of knows you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. Well, thank you all for coming. I do appreciate it. We are going to talk tonight about mictors. Is anybody here familiar with mictors?
Roger said he had some ears.
Heard of it before?
What's the hand over there?
Awesome. Mictors is actually fairly new to the state of Mississippi, so it would make sense for those of you who purchase things here that you wouldn't be very familiar with it. However, it is not new to the United States. Mictors is actually around before the United States. We asked earlier on that, you can't answer this.
He probably couldn't even. I don't remember. It's been over 2 minutes. So.
Does anybody know what year the city of Vicksburg was established?
1820.
Well done. This is almost 75 years older than Vicksburg. The story of Mictors began. First of all, what you have in front of you, you have the Mictors rye whiskey. So what we're going to do is basically, I'm going to kind of walk you through the development of whiskey and bourbon in the United States. All whiskey and bourbon pretty much start from Scottish and Irish settlers, primarily in Pennsylvania. Really in two regions, one that made a sweet style and one that made a spicy style. And in these regions in Pennsylvania, we kind of progressed and we kind of graduated to where we are today. So I'm going to kind of walk you along that journey. Very fortunate for us, Mictors actually has 4 different whiskeys and bourbons that really showcase each one of those different styles. So it really works out very well. So another trivia question for you, and I've asked this before at a previous tasting, which is the rum tasting we were talking about earlier. Does anybody know the very first tax levied by the United States government after they were established? Yeah. So, taxed and stuff for a long time. So, Mictors was actually started by a gentleman by the name of John Shea. He immigrated to the United States, settled in Pennsylvania, lived there with his wife and his beautiful family. And I don't know if any of you have ever been to Pennsylvania, beautiful place, but in the winter there's lots of snow. It's really, really, really cold. Back in,
I'm from Pennsylvania, that's why.
It's really cold. And back in the 1700s, we didn't have the luxury of television and newspapers, and I have an app for that. We had to find other ways to entertain ourselves. And so someone living out on a rural farm in Pennsylvania had to figure out something to do, especially during a long winter when you could not go out and farm. So what he did was he built his man cave. He went out in his barn and he built a still. And he started using his leftover rye and making rye whiskey. And he started making this rye whiskey that was so amazing that eventually this young general who was wintering his army in Valley Forge said, I've got all these guys that are getting frostbite and they're losing fingers and toes and they're trying to eat each other. I need something to calm these guys down. I need something to take a little bit of the edge off. So General George Washington said, where is the best hooch around here? I need to find some good stuff. And they all pointed him over to John Shea, and he went over to John Shea and he bought every barrel of Mictors that he would sell them. So this rye whiskey in front of you is actually what the American Revolutionary Army was drinking during Valley Forge. So it warmed the Army through the Revolutionary War. Now what you'll notice with rye whiskey is when you're composing whiskeys and bourbons, rye is what brings a lot of the floral notes, and it's what brings all the spice into it. It's what brings the complexity into it. Corn would be kind of like the sugar component, and rye would be more like the cinnamon component. Sometimes it's sweet, sometimes it's spicy. There's a lot there. You can't quite dial in exactly what it is. That's really what the rye does. So rye is typically used in making like Manhattans and Sazeracs and Old Fashions and that sort of thing. So this is one of my personal favorites. I absolutely love this rye whiskey. It is a little bit of a higher proof, so if anybody does need to put a couple drops of ice or water into it, by all means, feel free. So one of the unusual things about this is actually a single barrel rye. Not a lot of people market anything as a single barrel rye. But and we'll get to this a little bit more, but these guys really take a lot of pride, and you can tell just by feeling the bottle. It's a big, heavy, sturdy bottle. They took a lot of pride in care into it because they really feel like what they put in there needs to be taken care of. What happens with a lot of ryes is they tend to either be really, really sweet and they don't have enough of the spice, or they go the other end of the spectrum and they're so spicy it's really hard to drink. I mean, you take a sip, it dries your entire mouth out, and it's not enjoyable. But with this, there's a lot of complexity there, and I can pick up a lot of and him drinking Victor's rye whiskey to help fuel the American Revolution. We talked about how the very first tax that was levied was actually a whiskey tax. And so all these people are sitting there going, wait, hold on a second. We just fought a war, so we wouldn't have to pay rum taxes. And then we put this new government in place, and the first thing you do is taxes on our whiskeys. What the heck is going on here? We're not going to pay the taxes. That's it. We're not going to pay the taxes. So in 1790, we had the
Whiskey Revolution.
Yeah. And the Whiskey Revolution was people saying, we're not going to pay our taxes on this stuff. We're just not going to do it. And so they sent tax collectors out, and there were about 500 armed men who just fought against the British militia. And they said, you know what? We're going to go to this tax collector's house. We're going to go there with our guns and our horses, and we're going to point them at him, and we're telling him we're not going to pay taxes. George Washington very wisely sent diplomats over first to try and negotiate with them. That did not work, and eventually did have to send troops. And it was really the very first time that America said, you know what, we can put down an armed revolution, we can take care of our country. Now, once that was done, there are a lot of people that are pretty ticked off. So what they do? They said, that's it. We're going to get the heck out of Pennsylvania, and we're going to go way out in the sticks where nobody can find us. We're going to hop on the Ohio River, we're going to hop on the Mississippi River, and we're going to go way out in the boonies. And where they end up? Kentucky and Tennessee. Yep. And so they ended up in Kentucky and Tennessee, and when you get to Kentucky and Tennessee, you've got these lands that are absolutely wonderful for growing corn, and have all these great oak trees, which are great for making oak barrels, which are great for putting in this corn whiskey. But that is very different than the rye whiskey, which is where they were all trained. So the next one we have here, this is called the Michter's American Whiskey. Now, one of the big differences between an American whiskey, which is what they do here, is they're actually using bourbon washed barrels. So when they make their bourbon, which is their Michter's bourbon, they have to use American oak. Has to be the very first time it's ever used. After they've used it, that barrel's dead to them. They really can't use it for anything. So one of the things they did was they put a second, different type, a younger whiskey into these barrels, or pull it out at a younger age. It's unblended. There's no neutral spirits in here. This is their bourbon recipe. It's everything in there. They're just using that barrel for the second time. So what you're going to notice is it's going to be a lot sweeter. Much sweeter than the rye. The rye has all that spicy characteristic. This is going to be a lot sweeter. So this is also what began to happen after not too long is people were driving around their little carts and they had their little cure-alls and like, you know, hey, we've got some of this cures warts, it cures cancer, it cures headaches, it cures broken arms, all this stuff. And what happened is people that were actually making really good bourbon and whiskey, their names were being killed because there were people out there that were selling swill. And so at that point in time, a gentleman by the name of Colonel E.H. Hampton went and spoke with several politicians that he was friends with, and he was able to establish something called bottled and bond. At that point in time, they got the federal government to basically put a stamp on it and say, hey, we guarantee that this is actually a good quality deal. And that's where bottle and bond came from. So does everybody know what bottle and bond is?
No.
So bottle and bond, it has several things on it. Basically, again, people were going out and they were pouring out just swill. And so they said, well, how do we put a guarantee on there? Oh, well, my name's good enough. Well, no, your name's not good enough. But if you put a federal seal on it, then that will. So to be bottled and bond, it has to all come from one growing season, has to come from one distillery, has to be one mash bill, and you have to put it in, and it has to be 100 proof. And so you then put it into a federal warehouse. They put chains on the door, they lock it. You no longer have control of your own stuff. And so when a lot of people say, well, why would we do this? Well, the federal government didn't make them pay their taxes on it until they got their barrels out. So it was basically a way for them to delay paying their taxes. But then when it came out, it did have the government seal, kind of like a little wrap around it, and said bottled and bond. To this day, there are 3 or 4, I think, that are still bottled and bond. Rittenhouse Rye is one of the best examples you can see that today is still bottled and bond. So this is, it's made today, but this is made in the style of that era, when there's a lot of things going on that really said, you know what, this is good, this is enjoyable, but people really want to know what's in there. And at a day and age where you can fool people just by moving from one town to the next, we didn't have our smartphones and all that kind of stuff. It was really, really a different age. So what do y'all think of this?
It was good.
I think it's
Better.
a little bit.
For me, this is good, yeah.
A lot sweeter than the other one.
Absolutely.
Maybe
Yeah.
Those are still.
we're just getting used to it. Going
They're
down
still
some-
charred.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's the barrels they use for their
They
bourbon.
just use it the same.
Correct.
And Joel, once they've done it the first time, no matter what they put in there, it can't be bourbon because it can only be bourbon when you put it in there the first time.
Correct. Correct. And it has to be charred. So what happens when it's charred is when you char a barrel, you create charcoal on the outside. So the charcoal is going to help filter it, but also that fire is going to caramelize the sugars that are in the wood, and that's where the sweetness comes from. So once you put something in there, it takes all the char off. Then when you drain it all out, all that charcoal comes out, so you lose your filter.
Yes.
So this is the Michter's Sour Mash. Anybody tell me what Sour Mash is?
That's like when you Jack
Yeah, it's basically.
That's the stuff that actually gets distilled. After it's cooked.
Yeah, so with sour mash, what you do is you got your yeast strains, and so you use a little bit from the previous batch to kickstart the next batch, just like you would with sourdough bread.
Yeah.
So when you're making whiskey, basically all you're doing, to follow the process, you can make bread, you follow the same process in ferment it, you make beer, you follow the same process in distill it, you make bourbon.
Booyah.
It's all pretty much the exact same process. To make bourbon, first you have to make beer, and then you distill it. And so a sour mash is basically following the sourdough process. And just like with sourdough bread, it works better in some places it does in others, and a lot of that has to do with the atmosphere. So this is the sour mash. Sour mash is actually, a lot of people use this term. One company very notably that had a very short man and like the number 7. They put sour mash all over the place, but actually almost everybody does sour mash. Literally almost every single bourbon and whiskey that's made out there, they all pretty much do sour mash because one of the most important things out there that distinguishes you from other companies is your yeast strain. Everybody pretty much buys corn from the same people. Some people buy higher quality and lower quality. Some people are more meticulous about it. Very similar to in the restaurant business, everybody pretty much buys from the same purveyors. Some people's food tastes better than others. It has to do with the people that are taking care of it. And it's the same thing with whiskey, and it's the same thing with a lot of things. So this sour mash is actually going to be a blend of 50% rye and 50% bourbon, which is kind of two of my favorite things. So I get all the spiciness and all the floral and everything from the rye, but I also get all the sweetness and balance from the bourbon. So it really just hits kind of right in the middle for me. So out of all of these, my 2 favorites are the rye and this sour mash. I just absolutely love this one. And again, I'm a sucker for this.
This is.
So as we kind of progress through, so we had the bottom of Bond Act. After the bottom of Bond Act, what happened is we progressed a little ways. That was the late 1800s. In the early 1900s, we had some really, really, really evil people who thought they were going to inflict a plague on the United States and make it so nobody could drink any whiskey. And they won for a few years. Awful dark time. It was an awful dark time. But what happened is when Prohibition hit, they allowed several distilleries to continue to sell whiskey or bourbon for medicinal purposes. However,
That's why we drink it.
of course, however, nobody could, but you couldn't make it. So all distilling equipment, all stills and everything had to be broken down, which actually worked out fairly well because we were short on metal, seeing as how we're in the middle of World War. And so all distilling equipment of all kind all had to be destroyed. So you could not produce any whiskey. So these places basically became giant warehouses that slowly dwindled down. And a lot of people say the reason that Prohibition was really lifted is because the medicine was almost out and we needed to make some more.
Makes more money.
But when they did that, when Prohibition was lifted, all of a sudden all these companies that had been making whiskey previously didn't have their warehouses, didn't have any of their equipment, didn't have any storage, didn't have any backstop. And most of these that we're tasting, the young American whiskey we just tasted, tends to be about 3 years old. The rest are all going to be about 7 to 9 years old. So if Prohibition is lifted, these people are going, it's going to be 7, 8, 9, 10 years before I can produce a product, which means I'm going to devote 10 years before I can make anything. I don't know if I want to get back in the whiskey business or not. I've been doing just fine selling suits. So a lot of people didn't. And as a result, what flooded the American market? The people that had been making it the whole time, Canadian whiskey. And so Seagram's took over an entire generation because that was the only way people could get any whiskey. Now sure, you can make vodka and you can make gin and you can make tequila and things like that very, very quickly, but whiskey takes time. And so an entire generation grew up thinking that Canadian whiskey was true whiskey. In reality, it's a version of whiskey, but that's not really American version of whiskey. Michter's tried to come back after Prohibition. At that point in time, they were called farm burgers. And a gentleman by the name of Lou Foreman bought the brand. He had 2 sons. One of his sons' name was Michael. The other son's name was Peter. So he put the 2 names together and ended up with Michter's. Michter's kind of, they pushed on. At this point in time, they were still being made in Pennsylvania, but they really, really lost a lot of their steam after Prohibition. And eventually in 1989, the company went bankrupt. When the company went bankrupt, all the rights just kind of went nowhere. And several years later, a gentleman by the name of David Newman, who was a former CEO of Austin Nichols, a company that makes wild turkey, who's also a former Marine, did win a Purple Heart in Vietnam. He got together with a gentleman by the name of Joe Magliano. And those two bought all the rights to Michter's, moved everything from Pennsylvania, said, you know what, this is our dream. One of them was pretty old. He said, you know what, I'm going to make the best dead-young whiskey I can possibly make, and I'm going to make it exactly how I want to make it, price be damned. And so they bought the rest of Michter's, moved it to Louisville, poured everything they could into it, and they brought back originally just the straight rye, but have been able to branch out.
What's second one?
All right, so this is their bourbon. As many of you know and saw, and some of you have just read about, what really happened is after the Canadian whiskey came through and kind of did its thing throughout the late 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, through the Mad Men era, if anybody's seen that show. Really at that point in time, we started getting into Budweiser and PBR and Miller Lite and Coors, domestic lagers, and that really took over for a while. And then after the domestic lagers took over for a while, we had this like vodka bomb that just like blew up everywhere all over the place. And eventually people said, wait, hold on a second. So I'm paying for something to put in a drink that I can't taste. Hold on a second, what am I paying for? Cranberry juice? And so people started really, maybe about 10 years ago or so, there was really a huge resurgence into whiskeys and bourbons, which has been awesome. The problem is, as we talked about earlier, it takes 7, 8, 9, 10, 12 years to make a good whiskey or bourbon. And as a result, if you run a bourbon company, you have to try and predict what the market's going to look like 7, 8, 9, 10, 12 years from now. Lisa?
Yes. I was gonna give John some of this, I'm back.
If
He don't like this.
If you had to do your food order today for how busy you're going to be 12 years from now, how would that look?
Oh, it would be ugly.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's so hard to predict what it's going to be like. And with the resurgence right now, what we're running into is a bourbon shortage. So you're starting to see there's all kinds of these craft companies that are coming out. Really pay attention to how old those are. Some might be good, some might not be. They are following the rules. Can you make bourbon in Texas?
No. Well, technically, no.
Why not?
Because you can only make bourbon.
Is it not?
You need to call a friend?
No, because they're making bourbon in Denver.
You can make bourbon anywhere inside the United States.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So the rules for bourbon are it can be made anywhere inside the United States. You have to have at least 51% corn.
Yeah.
The rest have to be other cereal grains. That, like 99.9% of the time means that people are using corn as their primary, they're using rye or wheat as their secondary, and they're using a little bit of barley to fill in. That's pretty much everybody's mash bill. The percentages change, but that's the basic nuts and bolts of it. You have to put in a charred American oak barrel that can only be used one time. It has to come out at minimum 80 proof. So to be called a bourbon, it has to be at minimum 80 proof. So if you see something below 80 proof, it's not going to be bourbon. It could be a whiskey, but it's not going to be bourbon. It can only be cut with water. So they're going to put it in the barrel, they're going to age it, it's going to come out. Most people, when they put it in the barrel, they know that they're going to cut it with water, they're going to pay tax on it, so they're going to make the most that they can possibly make. So usually when it comes out of the barrel, barrel proof is typically going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of like 130 to 170 proof. And then at that point in time, they're going to cut it with water to their specifications, and they're going to get it down no lower than 80 proof. So another thing that happens is 97% of all bourbon that's made in the world comes from 3 counties in Kentucky. What's Kentucky like in the summer?
It smells good.
As a friends actually on a tour of all these distilleries.
Kentucky,
Trail.
Kentucky
Suburban
in the
Trail.
summer's hot.
They're about to go.
Hot summer.
They're about to go.
And what's Kentucky like in the
Eugene
winter?
just did it.
Not Pennsylvania cold, but it is cold. Yeah, it is cold. It does snow a good bit. So what happens is when it's really cold in the winter, and it's really hot in the summer, you have these huge temperature changes. So exactly, the barrels are going to shrink and expand. As the barrels shrink and expand, the liquid inside is going to move in and out through those grains, and so it's going to hit all those caramelized sugars, it's going to hit all that charcoal, and it's going to age very quickly and take on a lot of that herb flavor. In the hot summers, what's going to happen to the water? Evaporate. So the longer it's in a barrel in Kentucky, the more the angel share, the more that water that evaporates, and the alcohol is going to go higher and higher and higher the longer it's in there. So we had, for instance, typically a bourbon barrel, Elijah Craig, for instance, which is one of the brands that I represent. When we used to have enough that we could sell it, we'd sell a barrel of Elijah Craig, and then we'd get somewhere in the neighborhood of 22 to 23 12-bottle cases out of a barrel. We had one 2 years ago that a store bought that had 3 cases. Because it evaporated. It was so hot. Yeah. So if you take that and you think about, okay, well, how come when I drink scotch, it's like 18, 20, 21 years, and when I drink bourbon, it's like 7, 8, 9, 10 years. 12-year bourbon is usually considered a pretty old bourbon. What's it like in Scotland in the winter?
Cold.
What's it like in Scotland in the summer?
Cold.
They don't have a summer. It's still cold. So as a result, and then you put it down in a cellar underneath somewhere where it's cold, it's not going to move in and out through that wood, so it's going to take a lot longer.
I didn't pay attention.
Also, because of that, the alcohol is not going to grow stronger, it's actually going to go weaker. So scotch has to be barreled at a minimum of 70 proof. So the biggest trick with scotch is we got to get it out of the barrel while we can still call it scotch before it goes into a blended whiskey. So it's a complete opposite process based upon where the different areas are.